Kerry's Law, Ray-Bon's Act, NINA, Next Gen 911, SENet, MLTS, PSAP. There's enough acronyms and technology to make your head spin when you're talking about 911 services and Microsoft Teams. So join me, let's learn a little bit about it so we can talk to our customers, or you customers can talk to your Microsoft partners a little bit more intelligently and understand what's going on and what's coming. Okay, the way this video is laid out is I go through kind of the older technology first, because you got to understand that before you understand what Microsoft Teams is doing and how they kind of leapfrog the industry as far as emergency response technology and what they're using there. So join me, let's get started. Okay, let's go over some definitions in a broad view first, just in case I say something and you don't know what it is. And this is also good general information to know about 911. First, the NINA, the National Emergency Number Association. It is an association that develops technology standards that drive NG 911. It has many committees, working groups around the nation. There's an educational advisory board. There's the government affairs arm of it. So these are the guys that work with Congress and the FCC, legislate laws and things like that. So there's a lot to NINA. It's not so much government, but they have a lot of influence. I think they describe themselves the only professional organization or association that's solely concentrated on emergency services, how they work and things like that. So they work closely with PSAPs, advising them, things like that. They're like the Accenture for PSAPs, and also the advisory Accenture, for the FCC and government agencies, that are deal with 911. Okay, Next Gen 911. What is that all about? This guy right here. To simplify it, it's basically a methodology, systems, networks, and things like that. So NINA defined Next Gen 911, and the two topmost components, the two main components, is SENet, so you'll see that a lot, and Next Gen Core Services. The SENet is just the IP network, and they have recommendations and requirements for the network, right? It's got to be maybe MPLS, it's got to be able to carry real-time traffic, so there's some latency things around that. It's got to have redundancy, it's got to have QoS, so certain markings for media and signaling and things like that. So they kind of punched out this requirements document. Here's how do you connect up to the SENet, or here's how you build the SENet. And then the Next Gen Core Services, just all the software, all the recommended software to use, databases, things like that. So in a broad sense, that's what Next Gen 911 is. PSAP, the Public Service Answering Point. Easy way to think of that, it's the people that pick up the phone on a 911 call. Hello, what's your emergency? Those are all over the U.S. They're usually at different localities or regions that are more familiar with the regions and have direct connectivity to the local fire, rescue, police, and things like that. So they're all over the nation and the U.S. and its territories. There's about 5,000 of these guys. The emergency response service provider. To understand this guy, you got to understand how it was back in the day. And there's still some localities that are like this. So back in the day, we had local LECs, right? Local exchange carriers that provided T1s or POTS lines or telephone communications lines. Sometimes you would have to connect up right to the PSAP. So as a big campus, let's say, maybe you had a couple of dedicated lines to the local regional PSAP. Or more likely, your LEC would have a connection to the PSAP. So if you dial 911, it would come across your regular voice trunks to the LEC, and then they would say, oh, that's a 911 call, and I know this campus is in this region because that's where my T1s are connected, or PRIs. I'm going to send it to the PSAP over here. Now, think of that on a broader and a VoIP scale. People are centralizing trunking. They're buying these. They've been buying for a decade or more now. Been buying these VoIP systems like Cisco's Communication Manager, Skype for Business, and things like that. Centralizing these trunks, and when you centralize trunks, then how do you get it to all these PSAPs that are around the nation? Well, that's easy. The ERS, the Emergency Response Service Provider, like Intrado and like Red Sky, bandwidth.com comes to mind as well. These guys went out and said, I'm going to build an IP network and connect up to all these PSAPs all around the nation. And you send your 911 call to me. So whatever trunking service, maybe you're using Verizon VoIP trunks or something, and they're going to send me the ERS, this particular 911 call. And I don't care where you're at, I'm going to be able to route that call based on the DID number, that ELIN, ERL, ANI number. I'm using other terms here that we'll learn in a minute, but based on your caller ID, I'm going to route you to the right PSAP because I'm connected to all of them around the nation. So it's kind of a centralized clearinghouse for all 911 calls, and they could route it to the right PSAP. Okay, then we hear this term MLTS. This is in a lot of the regulations that we'll touch on here in a second, but MLTS, multi-line telephone system, layman's terms, Cisco Communication Manager, Cisco HCS, VCE, Microsoft Teams with calling plan, Ring Central. I mean, these are let's say call them IPPBXs, either on-prem or in the cloud. They're called multi-line telephone systems. All right, that's basically what the government or the NINA has deemed that's their name. Right, so when you see that, you know what that is. So why 911 again? Why are we talking about 911 the last couple of years? Well, in 2018, President Donald Trump signed H.R. 582. This has to do with the Kerry's Law, and H.R. 1625. Now, if you're looking for exactly what is in 1625, it's about a 2,200-page document, but there's the Repacked Airways Yielding Better Access for Users of Modern Services Act of 2018. It's a mouthful, but better known as Baum's Act. The bill completes a process that was really started in 2015. Now, let's take a little closer look at Kerry's Law and Baum's Act and what they have and what regulations they're imposing. Now, I'm simplifying this because I understand it simply also. I've read these things and I've kind of extracted out what, in simple terms, how I understand it. So Kerry's Law, basically direct dialing 911. What does that mean? That means I can pick up a phone on a multi-line telephone system, right, the MLTS, and dial 911. If you remember, some businesses and hotels and things, you'd have to dial 9 to get out, right? No more of that. Kerry's Law says anyone needs to be able to dial 911. And I failed to mention, I won't go through who Kerry Hunt was or Ray Baum. You can look that up on your own. There's plenty of YouTube videos that's going to explain who those people were and why this legislation came about. So, dial 911 directly. That's easy to understand. Notification of on-site security. Well, that's easy to understand, also a little harder to do. But if someone dials 911, and let's take the hotel example, someone dials 911, at the same time that it's dialed, someone needs to be notified. And the language they use, I peppered it in here. So front desk, admin, personnel, security desk, something like that. And it can be a call, SMS, email. And what the language in the FCC site uses is they have to be likely to see it. So an email, people are likely to see. An SMS, people are likely to see. A screen pop on a security desk, people are likely to see. So anyway, so that's what that is. And what does that notification need to contain? It needs to contain that 911 was obviously dialed, so they need to be notified of that, obviously. What address was given to the PSAP? So what address actually transported to the PSAP? When the PSAP person picked up the phone and said, hello, what's your emergency? They get a screen pop, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but they get a screen pop. What address was given? And then it must include, and I'm going to put this separate, a callback number. And then it goes on. It's weird. It says it must include, and then later on, I think a sentence later, it says if technically feasible. Okay, so that's what the notification is all about. Ray-Bon's Act. What is that about? It needs to provide a dispatchable location. Now, what we're saying is, it's talking about the PSAP. What does the PSAP need to get? They need to get a dispatchable location. So it can't be a hotel getting the main location, and the hotel has, 2 or 3 buildings, a left wing and or north building and south building, things like that. It's got to be a little bit more than that. Now, there's nothing in there that I read that there used to be state legislation, for example, in Illinois, I believe, that said, hey, if you have 40,000 square feet or more, you got to get a little closer with whatever you're screen popping on PSAP's screen. So if you had a 40,000 square foot building A, and 40,000 square foot building B, you could say, screen pop, someone dials 911 building A, and you would give, 123 Elm Street building A. If someone dialed 911 over here, you'd have to give, building B. Now, there's no square footage or anything like that in here. It just says dispatchable location must be the address plus something else. Okay, that's why I put this plus there. The address, the civic address, and then the something else that can reasonably get first responders to the person who needs help, or where the fire is, or whatever like that. So it's a little broad in its writing on the FCC site. There's nothing weird here. You can give buildings and floors and things like that, and that's what they're going after. So who and when does this apply to? Well, if you take this date right there, February 16th, 2020. So anything purchased February 16th, 2020, and after that, these rules are going to apply to you. So you can see what they're doing. They're going to grandfather some people, right? If you bought your system back in 2015 and it's still going strong, you're not going to fall under this. Okay, let's say you do fall under, you bought yours system, UCAS or Microsoft Teams or Ring Central or whatever, but you purchased it and implemented it after February 16th, let's say it's February 18th, 2020. Okay, then you're going to have to make sure by January 6th, 2021, that any fixed phones are going to adhere to these laws here. Okay? That's phones sitting on desks, phones sitting in hotel rooms, things like that. Okay? Fixed phones. Further, for your non-fixed phones, what are non-fixed phones? That's a Microsoft Teams app on your PC or laptop. That's a Jabber app on your PC or laptop. That's Ring Central app on your PC or laptop. Those are going to need to adhere to these laws January 6, 2022. Okay, so basically January 6, 2022, you have to have the whole enchilada at your campus, your location, your business. You got to adhere to all this right here. The last one is remote home users. Now, they didn't break out fixed or non-fixed here. So they're basically saying, if you deploy business phones at home, and if you have a PC with, let's say, Microsoft Teams, then the January 6th, 2022 date is for you. You're going to have to make sure that your remote users by January 6, 2022, are going to be able to adhere to this. So if you deploy phones, like I have a business phone, many agents and things like that, sometimes they have business phones because they're better quality, especially sitting at home, purpose-built. And a lot of people like that business phone sitting on their desk because there's lots of technologies now that let them connect up to the corporate PBX, whether that be Microsoft Teams, Skype for Business Online, or a Cisco UC solution with HCS or something like that. So yeah, that's why we're talking about 911 again. All right, I'm going to review some 911 wired evolution terms. Now, I thought about putting this in the definitions portion of this talk, but I'm going to vet these out a little bit more, or I'm going to explain these a little bit more and give you kind of evolutionary things that happen in the 911 world that are still going on today. So let's talk about Annie and Allie. So these two concepts right here, automatic number identification and auto location identification. As 911 laws started getting stricter and saying, okay, you have a big business and it's a campus, it has it's spread over a whole block, and the days of giving us the billing address, which was probably the main building, that's gone. We need to get a little bit more than that. That's when we started getting these databases where you would buy certain numbers, or you buy a bank of numbers, or 1,000 numbers or something from your local LEC, and then you'd have to give them, and some it's still like this in some places, a spreadsheet or something like that. And so you'd get these 1,000 numbers and you give them to your telephony guy, and then he goes and he starts giving out these numbers, this one's going to Anson, that one's going to Joe, that one's going to Alex. And then he would say, put in that spreadsheet, here's their name, this is their number, and this is their address. Okay, and that eventually made its way into a database. Okay, right here. And I'm kind of giving a little representation of that database right there. Okay, and the two pieces of that is the Annie, okay, and the Allie. The Allie meaning the database, the Annie meaning the number. So the Annie would be the number right here, and then the Allie would be, let's say, the spreadsheet with all the numbers and addresses. All right, so this made it a little bit easier to find people, right? You dial 911. It gets, and I'm going to call it the caller ID because that's just a normal term that people know. The caller ID would show up at the PSAP, right? She'd see a little screen pop, or he would see a little screen pop with the call ID. And then what that call ID would do, it had some a program that would go look in a database, and that database would then come back and look in the record and it bring that address back. Okay, that's it. That's all you need to know about Annie and Allie. There's a little more complexity behind that, but in simple terms, that's what it is. I have some other terms over here, the regional, LEC, and national. Nothing more than people used to keep these databases regionally, and now they're more kind of a national database with these ERSs and things like that. But that's all that means. So you'll hear also this PS-Allie term. Nothing more than the same concept that I just explained to you, except we added a column to the table, all right, in the database. So we can get a little more specific. So remember I told you there was some state legislation that started coming out that said, you need to get a little bit closer if you have some big campus or you have a big hotel. We need to know a little bit more than your address. We need to know the floor and the room and things like that. So PS-Allie came out and they said, okay, we're going to expand this little database, these records, give you another column here, and then you'll be able to put some more stuff in. So the same thing goes on. Someone calls 911, call ID pops up at the PSAP. The PSAP has some software that would go database dip the database, and it'd go over here, look up a record that equals to that, right? And this guy would bring back the record, and all this would pop up. Let me circle that a little bit better. Would pop up on the PSAP agent's screen. All right, LECs now and PSAPs, whoever's keeping this database, have portals. And those portals, now you can go to the portal and you can upload your spreadsheet, or you can update particular addresses. And what I mean by that is the end user, the guy that's taking care of the school campus. He's the telephony guy. He's got to log into a web portal, and then he can go hunt for this number and update that address, this address here. He logs in, got his PC, and then he looks up that number right there, and then he can update that if he needs to. So he's got kind of direct access to wherever this database sits. Usually it's at the LEC, all right? And the PSAP, the agents that answer the calls, they have some computer systems there that actually will look up the record based on the call ID. We can call it Annie if you want to. I want to call it call ID because it makes sense to me. All right, and then you'll hear these terms ERL and ELIN. What is that all about? Well, let me explain that with another slide here. All right, the best way to explain this is just think of the scenario of you have a campus, a school campus, and you have 10,000 phones, but only 1,000 phones have actual numbers. You know, the other 1,000 phones are just people calling each other internally. So you don't have numbers, you don't have real numbers that actually, when someone calls 911 and it shows up the PSAP, you need to provide a number, all right? And you can't just do the main number. Remember, that wasn't good enough. These state legislation started coming out. That wasn't good enough. You better get a little closer, you know, so that emergency responders can find people. So take an example, again, the 1,000 and 10,000 phones. You only have, you know, 1,000 DID numbers. What do? Well, you start making a customer E911 design using ERL and ELINs. Now, here, let's say the telephony guy, he's this guy, and you got the network guy. They're going to get together, and the telephony guy is going to talk to the network guy, and this is just one way of doing it, several ways to do it. But the network guy is going to tell the telephony guy, you know, the way I have all my subnets is in the building, I have subnet 1.0 on floor 1, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 on floor 4. The telephony guy is going to jump up and down and say, hooray, that's great, because my telephony system has some magic sauce to it, and it can tell where the phones are, whether they be soft phones or hard phones. It knows, because they're all IP connected, they're Ethernet connected. They know their address, and what I can do, I can perform some magic. So a telephone up here, oh, let's do that differently. Let me erase that telephone. A telephone down here, let's say that belongs to Anson, to me, dials 911 today. And instead of, maybe I have an extension of 100, so I don't even have a DID. So I dial 911, need an emergency here. And what happens is the call system, whatever is the call controller, is going to send out the call, but it's going to replace what we call the call ID, what we were calling call ID a little while ago. It's called ELIN here. But we're going to replace the call ID with this number right here, you know, 1231. 123 123 1231. And we've already given the database, right? The telephony guy already gave the database to the local LEC. And if that number, if that call ID comes across, the PSAP's going to see that, and their software is going to go do a database dip over there, and it's going to bring back this record right here, and it's going to say that 123 Elm Street, Austin, Texas, floor number 1. Okay, now we've solved for this phone being on floor number 1, and also we've solved for, let's say, my phone again. We're going to do the same thing again, but I got promoted to VP, let's say, and they moved me upstairs, or I self-moved. They gave me a desk, and I said, well, I'm taking everything with me. I'm taking my phone with me. I'm taking everything with me. I'm going right to my corner office in the 4th floor, and I got me a VP office now. I call 911 again, and this time there's, you know, the call server that controls all these phones is going to do some magic, and it's going to see that I'm on VLAN 4.0 over here, and when it sends out the call ID to the on the trunks, and eventually to the local LEC, and eventually to the PSAP, it's going to replace that number with 1234 as opposed to 1231 where it did the other day when I first called 911. PSAP's going to answer it, right? They have a little screen here. Screen pop is going to come up, and that number is going to come up as the ELIN call ID, let's still call it, and it's going to go do a database dip, and then what's going to come back to that screen is this information right here, and it's going to pop up there. Now they know this phone is at 123 Elm Street, but it's on floor number 4. So that's kind of the magic that these call systems are doing these days. Sometimes you need an appliance in along with your call system. For instance, if you ever heard of Unified Communication Manager, Cisco, and Cisco Emergency Responder, those two together provide this. Now, in the case of Microsoft Teams, this is kind of done all inside Microsoft Teams. Okay, so that's why I was saying sometimes you need an appliance, and sometimes you need just a call system itself. In fact, I should restate that Cisco Communication Manager can do this as well. Okay, there's extra secret sauce for the CER or the Cisco Emergency Responder that I may or may not talk about, but I should throw Cisco under the bus. Both systems support this as of today. Microsoft Teams and then Cisco Unified Communication Manager started supporting this, I think, in 11.0, in fact. Okay, so now what ERL and ELINs are. They're just fancy words saying I'm going to do a design and I'm going to make my first floor emergency response location number 1. And the ELIN I'm going to put on that design is this number. Okay, and then the call ID I'm going to send out when someone on this floor calls E911 is that number. Think about that for a second now, and you probably are asking yourself, or hopefully you're asking yourself, these aren't even real numbers, right? They don't exist on any phones. Remember, when I dialed 911, my extension was 100. So what if someone dials one of those numbers and it comes in our trunk? Where does it go? Well, it goes nowhere. Those are extra numbers that I had to buy from my local provider, from my local LEC, or my SIP trunking provider, or what have you. So you can see how this can get expensive because I got to buy these extra numbers, and I have maybe 1,000 locations, ERLs. So I need 1,000 ELINs, and I have to buy 1,000 more numbers. Okay, so you can see where that gets expensive. Now, you may ask yourself, I've heard of, Anson, I've heard of, callback being required too. Yes, some of these laws do require that if someone dials 911 and the call gets disconnected, the PSAP should be able to, whatever pops up on their screen over here, and remember, this is the number that popped up on their screen, and if they try to call back, this agent tries to call back that number, and remember, where's the last, I was up here, right? I got promoted. I was extension 100. I got disconnected, and they try to dial that number, and it comes in my trunk. Well, my extension is 100. It's not that number. The call systems, again, communication manager, others, have a little cache, and basically they're just saying, hey, I saw this phone dial 911, and I sent this call ID. Now, someone's calling that number that I just sent out a little while ago. Obviously, they're trying to call, most likely they're trying to call back this guy right here. If this number comes in, they're probably trying to call back that number, and they do a little swap-a-roo, right? And the call goes through, and the call is going to ring this guy here, and there's a cache in there that, after 2 hours or 3 hours, it's going to get rid of that cache and not dial that phone again. If that DID, if someone calls this number and it comes in the local trunk. So you're probably scratching your head and saying to yourself, well, Anson, you named this video Microsoft Teams 911, and you've told me all this old technology, and we're talking about Cisco and all this stuff. Well, you have to understand all that to understand the real reason I made this video. And it's because of this next-gen PIDF-LO, they call it PIDF-LO. So the PIDF-LO acronym stands for Presence Information Data Format Location Object. Fancy term. All it means is within the setup, within the SIP invite for you tech nerds out there, we're going to send all the location information. Okay? Now think about that a second. Remember a second ago, the old way, we were filling out spreadsheets and had to log in to databases or little front end portals where we could change the PS Alley database and things like that. Now we're saying, wait a minute here, I'm going to give not only the call ID, I'm going to give everything. I'm going to give the street address, the location, the floor, the room. Hey, how about the preferred language of the 911 caller? How about longitude, latitude? So there is what they call elements in PIDF-LO, and then it's basically an XML tag document with a lot of stuff in it. You can have all these elements in it, and you can provide all this information within the call flow, as opposed to having some database sitting out there and you waiting, the PSAP waiting for a call ID, Annie, ELIN, whatever. We'll call it a call ID. And then looking up in a database to look up that record and to match up that number to an address, and then pulling that back and then screen popping it so that PSAP agent has the correct address and can start sending emergency responders straight away before even talking to this person. So I just simplified it. ERS, I didn't talk about routing decisions. I might have a little bit in the prior slides, but if you think about that, if I'm getting inside my call setup through the LEC, eventually to an ERS, the clearinghouse, remember, that's connected to all the PSAPs. If I'm getting the address, I don't need a call ID. I don't need anything. I have the address, and now I can route based on the address to any one of my 5,000 PSAPs. Okay, that's one way to do it. You can still route on the number, obviously, if you wanted to do that. It's an IETF standard. Okay, that's something important. There's a couple of RFCs attached to that. Look PIDF-LO up. You'll find the RFCs. There's 3 or 4 of them that kind of reference each other, so they're kind of hard to follow. But you'll find one that says all the elements and what can be in those elements and how the XML document is supposed to be formed and things like that. The ERS support this, so all the ERSs support this. So bandwidth.com, Red Sky, Intrado. This has been out. It's nothing new. I think all this was published in 2011. So PIDF-LO is nothing new. It's just new being used by Microsoft Teams. Okay, so PSAP support. As I understand it, again, I would check with my local PSAPs. Most PSAPs support this. Okay, I've read different things. But remember, it doesn't matter, because if a PSAP doesn't support it, it's the ERS, the emergency service provider, that can flip things and say, oh, I got PIDF-LO, but I'm sending into the PSAP. The PSAP, they're on the old database stuff. They're not part of EZNet, whatever, but they don't support this stuff. Well, the ERS, Intrado, Red Sky, bandwidth.com, they can go and fall back to the old way, to the database way. So here's a graphical explanation or representation of how PIDF-LO works. And it's very high level, by the way. So there's still some configuration in Microsoft Teams, and I'll go over that in a second. But let's say we have all our configuration done. When this guy dials 911, it's going to go over to Microsoft Teams, right? Microsoft Teams, in this case, is going to have direct routing. That's what I'm signifying here. Now, if you have calling plan, this stuff still works the same. I'm just representing it as direct routing here. And you see, along with the PIDF-LO here, is going to be all your call information. All your dispatchable location information, as well as callback number, and all these elements based on if your call server, your call system, in this case Microsoft Teams, supports longitude, latitude, language preferences, whatever. But this stuff is going in along with the call flow. At this point, let's say somebody's providing Microsoft Direct Routing. There's an SBC. 911 call is going to go directly to the ERS. Right, that PIDF-LO information is going to flow directly to the ERS, and the ERS is going to send that to the PSAP, or if the PSAP doesn't support it, right, so I have the or Annie here, they're going to have a database out here, right, and if it gets to a PSAP that doesn't support it, they're going to get the call number, right? So they're gonna get the call number in there, and then the PSAP is going to be able to go database dip and do it the old way, okay? But obviously the way that everything is going to go to is very similar and very akin to wireless, right? Wireless, they send all the geolocation, all the dispatchable location, that just goes within the call, right? Because there's triangulation, there's GPS coordinates, that's all in the phone. Yeah, is it a stretch to think that phones are gonna, desk phones and things like that are gonna have GPS radios? It's not a stretch to think. Things are getting cheaper and cheaper, and maybe that'll be the case one day. If that's the case, man, you won't even have any configuration inside the Microsoft Teams space because they're just going to get GPS coordinates from this phone. Obviously, Microsoft Teams, people are using soft phones and things like that, and that's something different that I'll talk about here in just a second. Okay, so let's talk about the Microsoft Teams 911 services. And I have in big red letters there, still missing remote home users. I'll go through that in just a second. Let's get the terms done here. Now, there's a great talk. I'll reference it in the description from my Microsoft Ignite session, I believe, that kind of talks through all this stuff. I had to watch it several times to get my head around, all these terms. And basically what I came away with is, there's 3 different buckets that allowed me to get my head wrapped around this a little bit better. And I'm going to convey that to you here. So in lieu of going through all these terms here, again, you can find another video on that. I'm going to just break them up into 3 buckets. First, there's what they call the trusted IPs. Okay, and that's nothing more than the trusted IPs mean, am I on the enterprise network or not? Am I in the hotel? Am I on campus or whatever? So trusted IPs are going to be put in Microsoft Teams in the admin portal, and that's going to basically determine if Microsoft Teams does anything more. There's some other stuff called location information services. This is, if I pass this, if I get a check on the trusted IPs, and the trusted IPs are basically my internet-facing IPs. The only Microsoft Teams is out in the cloud, right? So everything coming to Microsoft Teams is going to be your outside address on your internet routers, right? So just think of that. All the ways out of your company, you might have several ways out, but those internet-facing IP addresses, those are what Microsoft in Microsoft Teams is calling trusted IPs. So obviously, if I'm coming from one, because I know those IPs, every company knows their IP addresses, right, as far as their internet-facing IP addresses. If my Microsoft Teams is registered and it's coming from one of those IP addresses, I'm obviously in the campus somewhere, right? Could be VPN'd in, sure, but you get what I'm talking about. If I check this box and say, yes, you're a trusted IP, you can do the rest. You can go to the next level here, and now we can start looking up or using our location information services to see, okay, let's do this ELIN, ERL stuff, maybe we're doing it by subnet, maybe we're doing a port switch, access point, or whatever. Now I can get granular on where the location is and things like that. So where am I, basically, is the next checkbox. Okay, so once we figure that out, we can give the right address out. And then you'll see this. So you'll always see this whole thing on one slide when Microsoft talks about it. And again, I'm providing my little boxes here to further delineate between these things. So when you hear the Teams emergency policies, that is, what do I do when someone dials 911? Okay, so let's say we're on campus and we dial 911. Okay, well, let's say a hotel room. And let's just put a Microsoft Teams phone in floor 1, room 1. All right. Am I on the campus? Yep, you're on the campus. Okay, where am I? Well, you're connected to switch 1, port 1. Okay, and we kind of marry the switch. Let's just say switch number 1. We marry switch 1 with a location. 1, 2, 3 Elm Street, and it has to be a dispatchable location, right? First floor, room 101. Or I said 1, sorry. Room 1. Okay, and that's how we marry this stuff together. Okay, when I've done those two things, the very next thing is going to happen is this stuff over here. What do I do? Okay, now you can punch out policies, emergency policies, that say, what do I do? Well, I got the Ray-Bonds Act and I got this Kerry's Law. I need to adhere to that. I think I got the Ray-Bonds Act okay because I'm sending out the right address and floor, plus something else. But I need to notify somebody. Well, this is where this team's emergency policies comes in. And then I can notify somebody. And then I have several policies that I can build, notify the manager, PSTN dial this person, bridge this person on in the 911 call. So Microsoft Teams has a pretty good Lego set when it comes to building emergency response. And that's pretty good for being as young as it is. And then we have network configuration. Okay, now this threw me for a loop because I started seeing subnet, but I said, well, wait a minute. Subnet is based on location. I have subnet over here, and that's where I'm marrying my subnet or port switch or whatever to an address. Hold on. Why do I have subnet over here? Well, based on your subnet, based on your what they call network site, and under network site there's regions and subnets. You can have several subnets in the regions as well. All this says is based on my, and I'm just going to call it location because it's easier to digest that way. Based on your location, you might want to do different, you might want to grab a different policy. For instance, if I'm on location building 1, I might want to notify and bridge on the security desk in building 1. Okay? Has nothing to do with this stuff. Nothing to do with, just kind of forget about that. If I'm in building 2, maybe there's not a security desk in building 2. So I still want to notify building 1 security desk, but there's a admin there. I want to bridge them on the call in the 911 call that someone in building 2 is dialing 911. I want to bridge that administrator on. So there's all kind of things that you can do here based where you're located. What do you want to do? Not what address. Not what address I want to give. What do I want to do? So hopefully that drives the point home there for you. So again, there's another talk that's really going to tell you the location information services and the network emergency policies and things like that. I want to leave you with this because it was a visual that helped me put it together in my mind. Okay, I have, and I just did this at my own place here. I have a building. It's got 2 stories on my property. And I have a house on my property. All right, and so what I did is said, oh, you know what? I'm going to do this stuff inside Microsoft Teams, and it'll help me understand it. And I have 2 routers. I have one router that's in my house, and I have one router that's in my building that are connected to the internet. So what I did is I said, okay, remember we talked about trusted IPs. Look at everything in green here. Everything in green is Microsoft stuff. So there's my trusted IP. So that's what I put in Microsoft Teams. I put in my IP addresses of my internet-facing connection. Okay, remember everything's got to check through there before I start doing locations and, giving numbers and addresses internally. And then I put this box. You see this box right here? This gray box? That's my location information services. All right? So I broke out my building and my house in 2 different locations. See, I have a location here, building 1, location there, building 2. Now, in my case, these are the same address. I don't live on 100 acres or anything like that. It's the same address. But, so that's, and then locations, I kind of tied in with my subnet. You see that? Okay, hopefully this gives you a good visual. And then you can go a layer deeper. Then I have places. So in my building, I have first story and second story. You can see those right here. Okay, and in my house, I don't really have a 2-story house, but I did it anyway just to, so I can do the same thing that my building had. I put story 1 and story 2. Okay, and then then I married those, right, to the civic address. There's the green stuff right there. Okay, so it had one civic address, but I had 2 different locations and 4 different places. Think about that for a second. One civic address, 2 different locations on that civic address. So I'm expanding. Let's call it a little database. I'm putting more columns in the database. Basically, what I'm saying. So think about it that way. Okay, and then look at this box I have. This grayer box right here. That is, I have 2 of those. You see there's one here and there's one here. I have 2 emergency policies. Okay? And I did those by subnet as well. Okay, remember I got to go put subnets in there because my location stuff has nothing to do with my emergency policy. So I have to do locations. I got to do subnets again in my emergency policy. So I have 2 different policies. If someone dials 911 from my house, I'm going to do this. I'm going to notify this phone, and I'm going to, notify someone on Teams too. Okay, if someone over here, if a phone over here calls 911, I'm going to notify this different phone, and I'm going to bridge someone else on. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good visual. It helped me understand it. And if you need to stop and look at this a little longer and then go look at the other videos on emergency response stuff for Microsoft Teams, go look at that first, come back to here, and then you'll get a visual of exactly what they're talking about because it's hard to understand. For me, it was anyway. Oh, and one more thing I want to say here. I know I was going to tell you that I was going to talk about remote. So let's say I was a business. Let's say I turn this router into a VPN router, and I'm out here at Starbucks, and I got my laptop, and I VPN in through here. Or let's not do that. Let's say I'm out here with my laptop, and I log into Teams. Teams is out on the internet land, right? Microsoft out there. When I dial 911, the first check is what? Trusted IPs. Well, I'm not coming from trusted IPs. So all this location stuff, emergency policy, whatever, you throw it out the door. Now, you can have a default location. So, all else fails, give this default. And that could be what they call in the emergency response land or 911 land, ECRC. So it's basically you would go to your ERS and someone would answer because it doesn't have a valid address. They just answer, hey, you've dialed 911. I need to send you to the right PSAP. Where are you? So that could be it. You could also send it to a help desk that you got or an emergency response on site. Maybe you have a couple of people at a security desk that are manned 24 hours. You can also send it to that guy. So maybe there's some guy on site. You dial 911 instead of going out to the PSAP. It says you're not from a trusted IP, so I'm going to send you over here. And there's a guy sitting here in my house, manning a security desk, and he's going to answer and say, "Hey, you're one of our employees. What's going on? Can I help you out? Can I direct you to the right PSAP?" So it can happen like that. So I say all this because today, as of September 11th, 2020, Microsoft does not support remote users. Right? They don't support remote users because there's no way to get the address where this guy is at. Now, there's speculation that they're working on something. I haven't read this, but there's speculation that they're going to come out with something, right? The only way to fix this is before you start Microsoft Teams on your PC, you have to make the user put an address in. Right? You might have seen that. You Cisco guys might have seen that in Jabber. Definitely supported in Cisco Unified Communications with Cisco Emergency Responder. And there's other systems out there too that will do this. But chances are Microsoft is going to come up with something native within their tools that's going to make you put in an address and then do all these checks and then going to send that over to ERS, and then the ERS is going to send it to the right PSAP. So I think so. If you made it this far, I apologize for my verbosity. In summary, we went through a few things, and I talked about Annie and Allie, explained that. We learned a little bit about ERLs and ELINs, and I gave you a visual of that, so that should have really drove it home for you. We talked about PS Allie. All right, I should have really put PS Allie in between Annie and ERL right here. PS Allie, remember, just giving you another column in the database in the old way to do things. And then we talked about ERSs. Remember, they're the clearinghouse. Usually SIP providers, SIP trunking providers like us, like Verizon, are going to have connections to those guys within our network, so you don't have to do it as a customer. And other SIP providers do the same thing. They're usually doing the same thing today. So that's a clearinghouse. Remember, you send them your 911 call. They have connection to all these PSAPs around the U.S., and they'll make sure that that call gets routed to the right PSAP based on call ID number, Annie, ELIN, whatever. But the new way, remember, is PIDF-LO. And that's the important one. That's what I was trying to drive home here on this one. So the PIDF-LO, remember, we don't need a database. The PSAP doesn't need to go dig into a database. If they support PIDF-LO from Microsoft Teams all the way to PSAP, that's where things are going. And there's not going to be any database dip. It's just going to come within the call. And yeah, you're going to get routed the route PSAP. Screen pop's going to be okay, all of the right information and things like that. And once Microsoft Teams fixes the remote home user and they're able to put in their own address when Microsoft Teams starts up, and they'll have some mechanism in Microsoft Teams that say, hey, looks like you moved, you have a different IP address or something, put in your address to make sure as soon as that comes out, you're going to have the whole enchilada and be able to adhere to all these new laws as well as the old laws. And that is it. Hey, thank you guys. I hope you've learned something, and I certainly learned some things investigating this. And thanks for watching. Okay, kids, class in session, and today we're going to review what last lecture was on and make sure we were listening. So last time we were talking about emergency response technology. We reviewed 911, ERS, Annie Allie, PS Allie, PIDF-LO, databases, NG911, ISINet, NINA, as well as a bunch of other things surrounding the emergency response technology. So let's see, can anybody remember what PIDF-LO means from last lecture? I see all you guys were listening. Remy, how about you? Tell me what PIDF-LO means. That's not the answer I was looking for, but I see my two other students here are eager to answer. Alex, can you tell me what emergency response service providers do?
Dad, don't you remember the time I called 911 on accident and the cops showed up?
I'm trying to forget that, son. But yes, I do remember that, and that is not the answer. Trinity, can you please, my favorite student, can you please, and smartest student, can you please save us and tell me what Annie Alley is?
Daddy, I'm hungry.